Hey guys, welcome to the video on immigration policy. Now this will just be an introductory video on what immigration policy is all about. Now before we start, we're going to look at the definition first of all. First and foremost, immigration policy is a strategic supply side policy, or supply side policy to manage the composition and number of migrants coming into Australia, from abroad. And by abroad, I mean overseas, or those who have an overseas passport. Okay, so before we go into what the different types of immigration are, we're going to look at how immigration policy, in theory, can improve our supply side conditions. So to look at this very generally, as we have before, aggregate supply is a component, or aggregate supply is formed by, or is a function of, land, labor, capital being our primary factors of production, as well as secondary factors, which are efficiency, I should say. The secondary factor, which is efficiency. So as we can see, immigration policy targets the labor aspect of aggregate supply. So with this in mind, we can see that no matter how much, regardless of how much land we have, regardless of how much capital we have, regardless of how efficient we are, without any labor, without any people, then that becomes all useless. So labor is a very central part of aggregate supply because we need people to produce. We can't get animals to produce because, after all, animals can't produce goods and services. That just becomes outrageous. So immigration policy targets this supply of labor entry into the country. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to break immigration policy down into three different aspects, and they're the three different aspects of immigration policy. So firstly, we have what is known as skilled immigration. And now this is the one that we're very familiar with. This is where businesses advertise, say they have jobs, they need professionals, they need managers, they need workers in certain areas, and they advertise it as overseas. And so they get the most competent, or the people who are best served in that aspect of work. So skilled immigration is when we add to efficiency in production as well as our labor force. The second part is what we call as family immigration. So this relates to the idea that when we hire workers, so when we hire a manager of a big firm, a big mining firm, we can't just expect them to actually come to Australia and live here permanently by themselves. Of course, they must have family, they have children, perhaps they have spouses. So that encompasses the factor, or the problem, that sometimes when people move overseas, they need their family or sometimes their very close relatives to move across with them. It becomes unfeasible to ask people to come to Australia and work with no family. And so that is what family immigration is all about, is when, say, your husband or your wife moves over to Australia, or your son or your father moves over to Australia, then you as a direct or close relative or family member are entitled to migrate over as well. So that's the second part of immigration policy, is family migration. So new citizenships based on relatives of skilled migration. Thirdly, we have what is known as humanitarian immigration. Now, this humanitarian immigration allows people who are under hardship to come over to Australia and find refuge. And this portrays Australia as a very caring and a very worldly nation who does care for those less fortunate than ourselves. So humanitarian organized immigration helps build our relationships or create a very positive national image to the rest of the world. So as we can see, there are three types of immigration, but however, the major source of immigration is from skilled migration, and that encompasses around 70% of total immigration. However, although skilled migration adds to labour force and improves our efficiency in production, there are many arguments against skilled immigration. And the major argument against skilled immigration, although it does add to aggregate supply, is that immigrants compete for jobs. So the argument there is that since economics is about maximizing living standards of our peoples, Australians, although these skilled migrants, when they move over, they become Australian citizens or they become temporary residents, they don't actually add to domestic living standards. And by that I mean that they compete for jobs with those already living in Australia. So in fact, rather than improving the living standards of domestic residents, they're actually improving the living standards of overseas residents who come over to Australia. And that's a major argument against skilled immigration, is that because they compete for jobs with local residents, they may lower the material or non-material living standards depending on your subjective views of our people. And that conflicts with the overarching economic goal. However, as we shall see in further lectures, skilled immigration here can in fact improve or help the government achieve their 5 economic goals. And we're going to look at that in further videos.